with Sasha Issenberg. Oops.
There we go.
That sounds dangerous. Do I hit continue or do I hit leave meeting?
Continue.
Okay.
You can
Thank
start
you.
that
I'm
on
glad
field
you're here
good.
to do tech for us, Matt. You know, I can't do that. On behalf of Midtown Reader, we're really glad to have all of you with us tonight for what will no doubt be a really fascinating conversation with Sasha about his new book, The Engagement, America's Quarter-Century Struggle Over Same-Sex Marriage. Sasha, I mentioned this earlier. I felt like I heard about this book from you a long time ago, and I am delighted to see that it has been published and to such critical acclaim. And before I forget, I will get in trouble with Matt and everyone else if I don't tell you, you need to buy this book. We have plenty of copies available at Midtown Reader. Sasha is sending us some signature cards, and so those will be available for a signed copy, but he also has signed book plates available at sashaissenberg.com. You just have to show proof of purchase of your book, and hopefully from Midtown Reader, though any independent bookstore we're good with. The reviews on this book have been fast and furious and really terrific. Phil Elliott with Time Magazine called the book insightful and breezy, tracing the evolution of both public opinion and politics around marriage equality. The work holds a mirror up to how much America has changed in a short period of time and how those in power actually followed the public embrace of same-sex marriage rather than led it. The Washington Post called it one of 10 books to read in June. And if you read the New York Times book review, and I know many of our Midtown readers do, you saw a terrific review this past weekend in the book review where this book made the cover of the review, a lively encyclopedic survey of the struggle for marriage equality. Little background on Sasha to get us started. He is the author of 3 previous books, including The Victory Lab, The Secret Science of Winning Campaigns. He has covered presidential elections as a national political reporter in the Washington Bureau of the Boston Globe, a columnist for Slate, a contributor to Bloomberg Politics and Businessweek. He is the Washington correspondent at Monocle, and his work has also appeared in New York, the New York Times Magazine, and George, where he was a contributing editor. He teaches in the political science department at UCLA, and as a recovering political operative, I can tell you that Sasha was considered by me and many of our peers one of the smartest, if not the smartest journalists covering politics while I was working in the process. His understanding of data and targeting was far ahead of other reporters and frequently far ahead of many of us in the process that were running campaigns, which may be why I am now selling books instead of running campaigns. Sasha will be in conversation tonight with Matt Dailey. I know you know Matt is one of our Midtown Reader booksellers. Matt's a terrific bookseller. If you come to Midtown Reader, he is our go-to on nonfiction, history, politics, religion. When he is not selling books, he is equally busy. He's a political consultant and he's an advocate for LGBTQ+ rights. He has built legislative support for non-discrimination laws, fought anti-trans bills, and was part of a successful push to ban conversion therapy in Tallahassee. And he is an academic. He is finishing his master's degree in applied American politics and policy at Florida State. So with that, Sasha, welcome. We're thrilled you're here. We can't wait to hear about the book. Matt, it's all yours. Take it away.
Thank you, Sally.
Thank you, Sasha. Go for it.
Thank you, Matt. Thanks, Sally. I'm really glad to be here. I brought a little bit of a reading. So let me do the absolute minimum to set this up for you, and then I'll go into it. The book starts in 1989 in Honolulu, which is, as you'll see, where gay marriage goes and from being this kind of abstract idea that mostly lawyers and legal theorists talk about to a real live political issue and a viable legal objective. And the central character in this is a guy named Bill Woods, who was the gay activist in Honolulu in the 1970s and 80s. And as you'll see, like I think many first generation activists in any community, was very entrepreneurial, very good at creating things, very good at getting attention for himself and his projects, not always great at working with other people, and ends up catalyzing inadvertently a remarkable shift in American life. So here we go. In August 1989, Bill Woods attended a planning meeting of the official Gay and Lesbian Pride Week Association of Oahu to propose that 15 years after Hawaii's only gay pride parade, the time had come to try again. Quote, "We had such a long period of being under the pall of AIDS," says Woods' friend Jack Law, "that finally, like everywhere else, we said, screw it, let's have fun for a change." The Pride Week Association existed largely for the purpose of hosting a rally following the concluding picnic of the Imperial Court drag queen pageant. Its board included Cheryl Embry, who earlier in the year had launched a quote-unquote gay rag with a more expansive editorial vision than Woods' 4-page photocopied newsletter, Gay Community News. Embry and her other board members were primed to look unfavorably on Woods, and when he described the parade he envisioned, with 3,000 people marching, they scoffed at his impertinence. They barely had enough volunteers to organize the rally as it existed. The biggest upgrade they were considering was for a candlelight ceremony the board hoped to add the following year. But like most efforts to discourage Woods, Embry's failed. He set to work, calling organizers of mainland pride parades and local officials to assess the work necessary to stage such an event in Honolulu. 3 months later, Woods incorporated the findings in a report he shared with the Pride Week board. Once committee assignments were distributed, Woods objected that his desired task went unmentioned. Quote, "I only wanted to do one thing," he said, "and that was to be a parade and rally coordinator." Woods pushed and the board relented, allowing him to create what they imagined would be a toothless committee to further explore its possibility. When the board members of the official Gay and Lesbian Pride Week Association of Oahu opened the December 1989 issue of the local Gay Community News, they were shocked by an announcement from its editor. Quote, "A separate organization has been established to conduct the planning and promotion of a parade and rally to become a major part of future Gay and Lesbian Pride Weeks in Hawaii," Woods had written. The association's co-chairs drafted an outraged response. Quote, "At no time was the authority delegated to you to plan a rally," they wrote to Woods. "Please work within this organization's framework and abide by its majority findings and decisions." Woods naturally did not oblige. He formed his own nonprofit corporation, the Pride Parade and Rally Council, and relied on friends for help. Joe Malillo, a chef with catering experience, agreed to oversee the parade's concessions, while Jack Law offered to host fundraising parties and a screening of Rocky Horror Picture Show at his Hula's Bar and Lay Stand. When it came time to apply for event permits, Wood picked one day prior to the Sunday when the Pride Week Association planned to hold its rally and new candlelight ceremony. He scrambled for ways to have his event, draft slogan, quote, "The 50th state is the first state in the gay 90s, upstage the established festivities." Wood asked the governor to be his grand marshal and the Royal Hawaiian Band to perform. An international cuisine festival would serve chicken fajitas, Kahlua pig, German sausage, and shave ice. And there would be a wedding. In 1981, 2 men had applied for a Hawaii marriage license, misleadingly identifying themselves on the application form as husband and wife and using gender-ambiguous names as cover. That summer, the Attorney General issued a memorandum affirming that only people of the opposite sexes could enter into a valid contract under the section of the state code that defines marriage. But much had changed over the following decade in terms of the acceptance of sexual minorities, as Woods' own activism attested. By 1990, Honolulu's mayor had issued an executive order banning employers from discriminating on the basis of sexual orientation. Woods had no legal training, but when he went to the same law books that state attorneys had reviewed in their effort to define marriage, he detected plenty of room for doubt. Quote, "In other states, there's a specific definition of a couple," Woods said, not quite accurately. Quote, "Hawaii is the only state that doesn't have a clear definition on the surface." To sponsor a marriage push of his own, Woods formed the Gay and Lesbian Education Advocacy Association and began looking for allies. He contacted the Honolulu office of the ACLU, which in 1986 had become the first national civil liberties organization to endorse, quote, "the legal recognition of gay and lesbian relationships," unquote, to qualify for the, quote, "benefits and rights enjoyed by married persons." But everyone Woods encountered at the state affiliate appeared equally unenthusiastic and non-committal about picking a fight over same-sex marriage. When a staff attorney kept on asking for more documents to support a potential case, Woods sensed it was merely his way of putting off a response, and the two had a heated phone call. Woods attempted to reach the executive director and board president, but his calls went unanswered. In September, Woods sent them a letter declaring that what he now called his gay marriage project had, quote, "a number of couples who would like to be married," and that, quote, "if we do not hear formally from you within 2 weeks, we will pursue other assistance." In a letter the same day to an ACLU attorney, Woods was blunter about how wounded he was. Quote, "I've reinvented the wheel with you about gay marriage because you needed to know why gay people would want to be married. I have waited and waited and have had no formal word from you in months," Woods wrote. Now what? Throughout the year, Woods insisted he had 25 couples who were eager to apply for licenses. He would arrive on Tuesday nights at the Hotel Honolulu for his gay men's support group with unsolicited updates on his search. "I've got another one," he'd say. Convinced that he had to persuade the ACLU that his marriage campaign would not fall away as a fleeting fascination, Woods contacted a reporter for the Honolulu Advertiser to record his intent. "Same-sex marriage ban may be tested," a banner headline declared across the front page of the Sunday paper. The article beneath, however, included only one couple Woods had ready for the altar. They happened to be his friends Patrick Lagone and Joe Malillo, the executive chef who'd been one of the first volunteers Woods had enlisted when he needed help to stage his parade. Quote, we feel we are a couple and we belong together," Joe told the Advertiser, days before submitting an application for legal assistance to the ACLU on behalf of himself and Pat. A few days later, Woods was contacted by two women who had seen the newspaper story and wanted to join his quest for marriage rights because of the challenges they faced as lesbian parents to foster children. He instructed them to complete one of the ACLU's request forms as well. Less than 2 weeks after that, Nania Bear called the community center to inquire about health insurance, and Woods invited her, too, to join in. Woods believed that the three couples stood a strong chance of walking out of the Department of Public Health as legally married couples. He had not thought through how he would respond if their applications for licenses were denied. He had no budget for a prolonged legal or public relation campaigns to make civil rights history, and he had not bothered to vet his recruits the way one might if plotting a test case. Quote, He didn't ask, are you an axe murderer, recalls Bear. He didn't do anything to see. Are you the Rosa Parks we need? And that's where one of the early chapters of the book ends. So, hey, Matt.
Okay. Thank you, Sasha. I really appreciate it. And thank you again for being here at Midtown Reader virtually. We forgot to show you a copy of the book. I am traveling at the moment, so I did not bring. It is a hefty novel. Oh, perfect. Sasha, The Engagement, America's Quarter-Century Struggle Over Same-Sex Marriage. So let's get into some conversation. You've written a few other books before this, a book about sushi, a book about medical tourism, a book about kind of the secret science behind campaigns. And so to start, why marriage equality? What brought this project about?
So I spent 2011 working on that book called The Victory Lab about the science of political campaigns. And over the course of that year, I was having a lot of conversations with pollsters or people who dealt with political attitudes in some form or another as part of my research. And over again, people would make a version of the same point to me, which is that they'd never seen public opinion move on a single issue as quickly as they'd seen it move on marriage. And nobody had a really good explanation as to what had happened or how or why. And that sort of was sitting with me throughout that year. And it was at that time that I guess a couple things happened. One, it was the first time I remember when the New York State Senate voted to legalize same-sex marriage, and then Governor Cuomo signed it into law. This was in the summer of 2011, and that New York was the first large state to enact marriage through the political process, not through the courts. And that was the first time that I, as somebody who covered politics for the prior decade, had been around for this as kind of like the dominant social issue in American life, came to believe that there was only one way this was going to end. I think there's sort of real open question before about which side would triumph. Would this be a one state experiment in Massachusetts? Could this go away and we would sort of look at it the way we look at Reconstruction, maybe, which is like a brief flowering of some new rights and liberties that then end up being sort of undone by backlash. And I sort of became convinced in 2011 that the trajectory of this was clear. I certainly didn't think it would happen as sort of quickly and smoothly from that point on as it did. But people had already started talking about this as the sort of defining civil rights movement of our generation. And nobody had put together the whole story of where it came from, how it emerged as this major conflict, and how we got from wherever there was to wherever here was, or here was going to be. And so I'd never really written anything about the topic. I mean, I think like literally as a political reporter, I typed the words gay marriage, but I'd never written a story about this. And so, I set out with what was a pretty grand ambition at the beginning, which is to try to tell a sort of definitive account of this political and legal arc. And, what changed obviously was I didn't anticipate there'd be a Supreme Court case, let alone a sort of resolution of this issue, and that there would be a sort of end to the life of this issue as well.
So this book is literally 10 years in the making.
That's right.
Well, it which I guess makes the weird pandemic delay seem a little smaller in comparison, but gosh, the scope of this book, it's maybe the most readable nonfiction like political history book of its size I've ever read. And that's kind of a credit to you and the way you structure your chapters and the way that you tell stories. But when you started the project, did you know how big the scope was going to be?
No, I mean, I knew that this was a big issue, and one of the things, the other books you mentioned, this book I wrote about sushi and globalization, about the global sushi business, a book about medical tourism, the book about the science of campaigns, those are all subjects that I basically defined, and so I could basically decide what my book was about and what my book wasn't about. And so to take like a obvious, if slightly glib example, like I decided I was going to tell the story of the global sushi business through tuna, and like not through salmon, because I picked the subject, and I decided like which innovations and political campaigns I wanted to focus on and which things I didn't want to. And so, in those things, I controlled the scope of the narrative, and I can make decisions based on the story, based on what I thought was sort of important in the sphere that I was documenting. In this case, there's like, this history exists apart from my definition of it. So I understood that this was something that had moved through a bunch of different states where you had sort of intense conflict, very little, none to very little of which had been well documented by journalists as it happened. That there'd be stuff that's happening in courts and in legislatures and in the public, that there would be stuff that's happening in Washington, in courts and in Congress and the White House, that there would be this big sort of story of social and cultural change that's the foundation for all this. So I knew that there's a lot that I had to get to, but I didn't, I think once I sold the proposal for this in the late spring of 2012. And at that point, as I said, like, I had no expectation the case would get to the Supreme Court during the time I was working on it, which initially I had a deadline of early 2015. And I, once that it was about 6 months into the project, 6 months after I sold the proposal, that the court accepted the first two marriage cases. And already at that point, I went back to my editor and said, let's, we had a common ambition, which was that this would be what I didn't want this to be was a sort of newsy topical book. I read a lot of the, like, let's say Trump books, and some of them are good and some of them are bad, but, very, very few of them, most of them get superseded 6 months later or 2 years later by another book. And this is true, like, a lot of sort of topical political books. And I had an ambition that I wanted this to be a sort of durable account, and my publisher shared that. And so we sort of pushed back the deadline, and then it became clear that like this was probably going to end up being settled. This could during the time I was working on this, and that I should take the time to cover not just the resolution of this, whether it's at the, in the courts, but whatever the fallout and backlash might be. But the scope of it changes, not just because now there's like you have to cover all these new cases, and but I think that the scope of the broader scope of the story, which is not just, hey, here's a big issue that we're fighting over, but really, what I ended up realizing it was about this issue that basically came out of nowhere, as you see from what happened in Hawaii, in many respects dominated our politics for, a decade and a half, ends up at a landmark Supreme Court decision, and then kind of goes away. Like, we just don't talk about this anymore. And same-sex couples are getting married. We accept it as a matter of life, but we don't ask politicians for their opinions on it. Like, they're not cable news segments where people debate this thing anymore. It's like, it's not a political issue. And so that, I sort of conceptualized the scope of the book differently once I realized that there was going to be like an actual ending and not just, kind of the country reaching some nebulous sense of consensus around this or whatever. Did I lose you, Matt? Did I lose Matt? Matt, are you back? Your sound, you're muted.
There we go.
Okay.
I'm so sorry about that.
No worries.
I was sitting there asking myself, you froze. I'm like, did we lose Sasha or did we lose me? And then it disappeared. And it was like, okay, we lost me. So where were we?
I just sort of explained how the scope of my book changed once I realized this was getting to the Supreme Court.
Okay, perfect. And so, I only lost maybe the last minute of that. And so as someone who read the Victory Lab and as someone who read this, the thing that I kind of take away from your writing style is you are a quintessential storyteller. And that's the journalist and you, the reportage. But like gathering these stories, people like Bill Woods and the Hawaii movement, Dan Foley, that whole early history that, like you said, hadn't really been clearly reported yet.
Yeah, I mean, so one of the things I did, especially in the early period, I kept on looking like, let me go find the like great New Yorker story that must have been written about this case or about this, and none of that stuff had been written. And I think a lot of it was that having gone back now and read, most of the, all of the significant media coverage and probably most of the media coverage of this whole debate over 30-year period, nobody really took this seriously as a political issue until, roughly 2003-4, when the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court rules in favor of marriage and same-sex couples start marrying in Massachusetts. And it's also the period where the federal marriage amendment gets introduced and President Bush endorses it. And again, it gets majorities in both houses of Congress. And before then, it was sort of treated, I think, as a sort of like a culture war sideshow issue, like roughly on par with the way we talk about, like, I don't know, Dr. Seuss or like critical race theory, or, in the 90s, it was like, should Two Live Crew be censored and like, should Ebonics be taught in school? But these kind of like goofy little local things we fight over, but not like, oh, this is the makings of a major conflict over civil rights in our country. And so I went back to this early stuff and was just sort of amazed at how I, in many cases, would, be one of the first people to be trying to tell this in a rich way. It got like, this Hawaii case that emerges out of Bill Woods' stunt gets news coverage there, but nobody really, one of the mysteries I had in my reporting, I made 3 reporting trips to Hawaii, was the case got covered as it went into court. When the court, the Hawaii Supreme Court becomes the first court on earth to rule in that the fundamental right to marriage in the state constitution could extend to same-sex couples in May of 1993. And the facts of the case are clear that the origins of this is a day in December 1990 when Woods leads these couples in to request marriage licenses. It's clear he wasn't a lawyer and didn't have a lawyer ready to take this case or a legal strategy. But the one thing that was unclear to me is, so why the hell is he doing this? Like, it was clear that he had not built this to be a test case. So why, what was his motive? And, Bill Woods passed away in 2007, 2008, something like that. I never got the chance to meet him. His surviving spouse is alive and allowed me to rummage through some boxes of old stuff. And I found, Bill's papers from the period and was able to reconstruct a lot of what you just heard, and then interview many of his contemporaries and folks in his orbit about that world. And, but that was the big mystery. And, and that's the origin story of this. And it's, it's a less grand origin story than the stories of women's suffrage started at Seneca Falls, and they had a sense of historical moment about what they were trying to accomplish there. Stories about Brown v. Board, maybe started with the founding of Howard Law School and the sort of concerted effort among the Black civil rights community to develop a kind of legal capacity to fight school desegregation. This thing starts with this like super petty, very parochial fight over a pride planning committee. And I, part of the reason that I really loved setting the book there and reconstructing this in all of its, like bureaucratic, small bore bureaucratic pettiness. I mean, the type of thing that I hope that excerpt gave people who've spent too much time on event planning committees some form of like PTSD, but just how small stakes this was, and nobody knew what they were getting into. And so much of the early reporting, the couples who get involved in this, you see people just stumbling into this, and they don't know that they are at the beginning of what ends up being a major historical shift in American life. And I think that the impulse or instinct is that once something reaches the Supreme Court and you get a landmark civil rights decision out of it, that because we see the ending is just, we assume that it was inevitable. And what I wanted to show throughout this process is none of this was inevitable. It wasn't inevitable that this was going to emerge as an issue. It wasn't inevitable that the gay rights movement was going to coalesce around this as a goal. It wasn't inevitable that their opponents were going to try to stop them. It wasn't inevitable that like any part of this, and that you have a series of choices and decisions that are made by individuals and institutions. And my goal in the sort of reporting was not just to have characters who like carry the story along, which I think is a sort of natural impulse of a lot of journalists who go to write books, which is I want to write about this thing, so let me find a character who like is the subject of each chapter. But I wanted to reconstruct the decision making of people to understand these choices that they made that end up having this sort of huge impact on the world we live in.
For me, and I have lectured on a lot of this history before to student groups and pastors and lots of folks. But hearing the individual stories that, like you said, they just weren't written down before, and being able to take that context, I think one of the more tragic things for me as I was going along that really just like hit me in the gut was towards the end of Section 3, you're talking about the passage of DOMA, and you're talking about the attempt to package ENDA, the Ending Non-Discrimination Act, the Employment Non-Discrimination Act, with that decision. And I had known that effort failed by one vote, but the story of David Pryor and his son's surgery and the helicopter on the landing pad and all of these logistics, how close we came to that passage then. And now we're still, the current version of ENDA in the Equality Act is still being debated, like 25 years later. How something as seemingly inconsequential as we'll get him next year vote has led to another 25 years of congressional fighting and advocacy from the Human Rights Campaign and groups like Faith and Public Life, who I work with on the side. Just this collection of stories is a treasure for the movement, and I just want to thank you for that. And with that in mind, I want to know do you feel like there's one or two takeaways from the fight for marriage equality that we should be applying to our current understanding of politics? We as both as like political people or as just Americans interested in politics and where our country's going.
Yeah, I mean, one lesson which in a certain way is small, but I think opens up a lot of interesting questions about, you mentioned HRC and Faith in Public Life, but like opens up a lot of questions about just how our sort of interest group advocacy organizations are structured is you see the creation of this group called Freedom to Marry. And it's launched in 2001 as, they call it kind of a strategy shop. It's like a very small sort of think tank that's like trying to push along interest in same-sex marriage, but doesn't have like a lot of money or people working on it. And it relaunches in 2009 with a bunch of money from some, gay mega donors. And at that point, is sort of being entrusted to coordinate a national strategy that has been developed initially in 2005 with the goal of setting up the conditions for a successful marriage case by 2025 before the Supreme Court. And this group, Freedom to Marry, is it's not just focused on, it has one goal, which is marriage equality in the 50 states and the District of Columbia through either the political or the legal process. And they call themselves a campaign because they say that they'll put themselves out of business as soon as they reach that goal. And this is not the way that most advocacy organizations are structured, which are built either to serve the needs of a constituency or demographic or geographic group, or often like a bucket of related issues that often grows with time, so and so you think about the Human Rights Campaign, and it sort of does both of these things. It serves a coalition LGBTQI, basically sexual minorities in the United States. It says that it represents all of their interests through the political process, and it thus has a whole bucket of issues. They're concerned about employment non-discrimination, but they're also concerned about hate crimes being prosecuted in a certain way, and they also care about gender identity issues in sports, and the issues change every year, but it's a wide bucket of issues, a deep bucket of issues. And one thing you see is that the Human Rights Campaign becomes a punching bag throughout its history, but in some of these marriage debates, particularly around the Defense of Marriage Act and then the Federal Marriage Amendment in 2004, basically for not fighting hard enough in, what are almost certainly going to be, lost causes in the short term. And they get attacked by activists continually, and to this day get attacked for being sort of too corporate or too obsessed with their own, access and their standing in Washington, and thus aren't willing to sort of be adversarial. And I think that's a sort of accurate description, but their motives the incentives are like to do that because, you go back to 1996 when the Defense of Marriage Act comes before Congress. They see an opportunity to pass this non-discrimination bill and broker a deal that comes, as you note, very close. But they're also doing stuff like, trying to get Ryan White AIDS Act funding extended, and are starting to get moderate Republicans who are willing to meet with them about AIDS funding. And, taking a hard line against DOMA would mean, picking a fight with these people for something that you're not going to get anything out of them other than a fight, and possibly lose the ability to get their ear on these other things. And so, I think that for the way that they were built, they acted very rationally. And Freedom to Marry comes along, and they just have this one goal, and they're not concerned with like long-term relationship building. They're not thinking about how does pushing on marriage affect these other related issues, adjacent issues. They're not thinking about their long-term. They definitely care about their donors, but they're not thinking about the long-term kind of donor or member base that a lot of interest groups are motivated by. And so they, adopt a bunch of tactics and strategies that are quite different. And so, we all remember that Joe Biden goes on Meet the Press in May of 2012 and says that he supports the right of same-sex couples to marry, and Obama announces that he does the same 3 days later. Why was Joe Biden being asked on some random Sunday in May 2012 his opinion on same-sex marriage? It was not something that was in front of the White House then. There was nothing that the president or vice president could do on this as a policy question. But almost 3 months earlier, Freedom to Marry had started a petition drive to try to get the Democratic Party to change its position in the party platform at the convention that summer. And so They get some former DNC chairs to lend their names to it, and then Nancy Pelosi gets asked because she's going to be the chair or whatever of the convention, honorary chairperson of the convention, and she says that she does, and now all of a sudden, everybody else who's going to speak at the convention starts to get asked, and Democratic elected officials in Congress start to get asked, do you agree with Speaker Pelosi that the Democrats should change their platform? And that bubbles up. And then people in the administration are being asked, and eventually Joe Biden gets asked. And that is something that the Human Rights Campaign would have never done, because the idea of like, let's try to jam Nancy Pelosi on an issue at the risk of antagonizing her and making it harder to get her invested than next time you come around, the stuff that they were, or let's, find a point of conflict with a Democratic administration. At this point, one of the big priorities was an executive order on getting federal contractors to agree to adopt non-discrimination policies. And no other group would have said, let's pick a fight with a favorable administration on this symbolic thing that where we could lose our ability to have good points of entry on real substantive things where we're getting progress. And Freedom to Marry was unusually structured. They did put themselves out of business in 2015 after the Supreme Court decision. And this is, it's not to say that every issue needs to be structured as a campaign. There are huge advantages to having ongoing interest groups, but I think it when you think about what they were able and willing to do because they were not thinking about their long-term standing as an institution, and they were willing to take risks and think differently in strategic terms. And I sort of wonder, how might the gun debate be different if instead of every town or handgun control that are trying to do a whole wide range of things related to, stopping gun crime in the United States, you had a group that was just focused on banning ghost guns, or just focused on waiting periods or background checks, or just focused on getting the CDC to track gun crime as a public health issue, and disaggregate all the individual issues that have kind of been bundled together and that people are trying to think about as in a big basket. And, and by extension, and I think the question for any people doing any type of advocacy, whether at the very local community level up to national stuff that's going to end before the Supreme Court, that's sort of triggered by this is your organizational structure, does it match your goals? Or is your organizational structure about something fundamentally different than what your actual priorities are? And are those things in tension with one another?
And so for a reader, for a lay person whose only understanding of what happened is going to come from this book, or is going to come from the news or the media that they consume, what do you hope that they understand once they've finished the story?
So, I think understanding this issue came out of nowhere is really important. Like, it is not inevitable what we will debate as a country. It is, I take you back to, you see in the 1980s how the within the gay and lesbian community, to the extent that people were talking about marriage, there was a real split about whether it was even a desirable outcome, an ideological split, a strategic split. And the thing that unified sort of gay and lesbian activists and lawyers who'd been divided about whether marriage was worth fighting for was that their opponents elevated it into a national issue. And the story is full of unintended consequences. I think, as I said earlier, like, individual decisions about tactics and strategy that really have a big impact. And I think it shows sort of the agency that individuals and organizations can have on determining not just, who wins and who loses in political conflicts, but what are we talking about? What are the issues that are before us as a country? And so, one of the things that unless you guys have a lot of 9-year-olds who watch your live streams at Midtown Reader, I presume everybody here has lived through a significant portion of this debate, and remembers some parts of it from personal experience or following the news. And, part of what I wanted to do was there are going to be parts of this, like I assume the Hawaii stuff, that are entirely new to people. And then there are going to be parts of it where you're like, oh, I remember when Gavin Newsom started marrying gay couples in San Francisco, or I remember when Barack Obama said that he now supported same-sex marriage. But, the stories, often those things get covered in sort of isolation from one another as discrete events. And I think we finally have the perspective to be able to look back and see how they fit into a broader arc of social change and political conflict. And that was sort of my and it's not always predictable how we're going to get from one point to the next. And that was sort of what I tried to do with the book.
Well, Sasha, I've got one more question for you, but before I get to that, I would just like to remind those in our audience, you can submit a question after Sasha answers this one. I'm going to toss to you for your questions. We've already got one in the queue, and so if you have something you'd like to ask Sasha, now's the time to go ahead and start typing that out. And so one last big overarching question. It's really obvious why this history should matter to members of the LGBTQ community. Why should this matter to straight people?
Yeah, and I say this as a straight person. So, as a straight person I was unmarried. I was a single straight person when I started this book, and about midway through the process of it, I became a married straight person. And I will say, just in my own life, as somebody who had never given much deep thought to marriage, I sort of always defaulted to the assumption that I would want to get married, but I'd never actually given a lot of thought to what marriage meant. Most of my thinking about this has been shaped by reading like legal briefs and court opinions. And there's some beautiful writing in some of those. This was a debate that we, partially because I'm not a member of the LGBT community, I was conscious of this, but also, I think the scope of the book, this is not a work of LGBT history or gay history. It's a work of, any more than, books about the civil rights movement or purely African-American history. This was about a big debate that the entire country was engaged in about, family, arguably the most foundational institution and unit in our lives, with and how to balance a desire for justice and equality with respect for tradition and that was and it was a part of the reason it engulfed the whole country so quickly is it was a very graspable issue. I mean, there are a lot of political issues that citizens have to work very hard to develop an opinion on, like, what should the residual troop force be in Afghanistan? Like, should we have an individual mandate as a mechanism to bring people into the, health insurance markets? Should the top marginal tax rate be 39% or 36%? Like, these are not, instinct level answers for most people. I explained to my 5-year-old nephew the other day what my book was about in 2 sentences, which is, basically it used to be that boys could only marry girls, and now boys can marry boys and girls can marry girls. And my book is about how that changed. Like, that's a very graspable concept to everybody. And we dealt with this as a society and through all the different institutions of society, through our courts, but not only through our courts, through our political processes, through just shifts in public opinion, the agency of people coming out and changing the opinions of the people in their own lives and their communities. And so, this was, I think that the sort of, this is the most significant change in American politics certainly on a domestic social issue in my lifetime. I think that I grew up reading really, in high school and college, reading really big books about the civil rights movement that journalists had started writing in the mid to late 70s. And part of my ambition was to do something similar here, was to, account for just a major generational change in American life. And I think it's something that one thing I was very conscious of doing was the story's not just about the proponents of gay marriage. You spend as much time with the opponents of same-sex marriage and with people who change their minds. And so, I didn't want to write a sort of like reflexively triumphalist account. I wanted to show the struggle as it played out. And I think you get a pretty good understanding of not just, of why people were opposed to same-sex marriage, but how they went about sort of mounting their campaigns against it. And I think it amounts in many respects to kind of a sort of, secret history of the culture wars over the last generation in American life as well.
Secret history of the culture wars needs to be on the promo for the paperback. Just
okay.
Mark that, put that on a sticky note somewhere. Sasha, thank you so much. We've got 2 questions for you today. The first one is a multi-part question, and it's about your writing process. So talk about your writing process. How is writing a book like this different than like typical journalism? And then the last part is, when are you most inspired to write?
Great. Thanks. So, I've been as Sally, I guess, Recount. I've been a newspaper reporter. I've been a magazine writer and editor. I've written for websites of various sorts. The big difference is it's not just that you have like more time for your deadlines, but that the ambition that you can bring to a topic changes. So, when I had a newspaper story, my goal was to add something new to the topic, but I was sort of constantly calibrating what's the best I can do on this topic, by 3 p.m. this afternoon, by Friday afternoon. But, fundamentally you start narrowing down your ambition to, what are the 8 most effective phone calls I can place right now? Are there 1 or 2, reports or like primary source documents that I can dig into? I can make, 1 reporting trip. I can go to 1 city in the next few days for this. Where do I go? And you're sort of weighing your ambition to do something distinctive on a topic with these incredible constraints of time and space and sometimes reporting budget and stuff like that. When you do a magazine piece, now the aperture extends a little. It's not just a few hours or a few days, but sometimes it's a few weeks or a few months. And you can, you could set your sights a little higher. Now it's like, okay, well, what could I do that's like the definitive profile of this person? And, I can probably go to 3 or 4 different cities for reporting, and I can make 50 or 60 phone calls, and I could read a bunch of books and, whatever. But even so, like ultimately you actually sort of at some point have to kind of trim your sails into what happens, because you're up against a deadline and there's space constraints. The thing with a book is that time is never really, I think a certain type of perfectionism becomes possible as a writer approaching a subject at a book length, where there are some things that were not gettable in this book. Like I couldn't get people, there were some people who wouldn't talk to me, certain documents I couldn't get. But if there are ways that this book comes up short, it's on me. Like there wasn't enough time or not enough space, or, certainly I had a reporting budget, but I had a lot of flexibility within it. And, there was nothing I didn't do because I couldn't get there or didn't have, if only I'm not asking. There are a lot of newspaper stories with like, oh, if I only had 3 more phone calls to make, I could have unlocked this. That's not something I'm asking. So I think that's the big difference. And that, you can go back and really work through what you're writing in a way that certainly for newspaper or sort of online writing, often, there's not a huge difference between your first draft and the final version. And here there can be a lot of that. My writing process is like kind of messy in that I'm sort of reporting and researching and writing and rewriting and editing and kind of mapping, structuring the book all simultaneously. And I do not have a particularly like ordered sequence of how I do those things. And I often need to start writing to kind of understand the materials I have. I come back from a reporting trip with, hundreds, thousands of pages of documents, and I do a little bit of trying to organize them for myself, but often it takes trying to actually write the story to realize where the holes are in my reporting, like that Hawaii stuff, for example. I came back with all this correspondence of Bill Woods's and these newsletters that he had collected and these clips and all, a whole bunch of stuff. And then I start writing, I'm like, I don't understand. I know he did this in June. I know he did this in July, and I don't understand the relationship between these two things. And now it's like, okay, now I have a bunch of phone calls to make to people to get to the bottom of that, or let me go read the press clips to understand what was going on. And so there's some writers who can, I think, be very structured in terms of like, I do my research. Now I have all my research here and I start writing, and then I rewrite, and that's just not the way it works for me. When am I most inspired to write? I get up very early in the morning, and I don't know whether it's a matter of inspiration or just an easy ability to focus, but I am often most productive in the mornings and on the weekends. And I think most of that is just that there's like the fewest distractions, no emails popping up. Certainly, the part of this I was reporting during the Trump years, I'm easily distracted by news and early mornings. I mean, there were some crazy Trump tweets early in the morning, but it seemed like I was less likely to get bothered by some like radical, like Rod Rosenstein's gonna, put the president on blast in the next hour type of like headlines, which sent me off the rails. So, and then I will just note from a process perspective, because I rarely get the chance to talk about this. 3 times while working on this book, I took container ships to isolate myself to be able to focus on my writing. So I crossed the North Atlantic, the North Pacific, from Oakland to Busan, South Korea, and then I went from Newark, New Jersey to Buenos Aires, and passed not too far from you, docked for a few hours in Jacksonville, where I had to buy a new computer charger. But that was my effort to some people I know go to like a cabin in the woods, and I do not want to be in a cabin in the woods for a variety of reasons. So I booked myself a room on a freighter instead.
There you go. Any links necessary to finish the project.
Exactly.
Okay, last question. Tell us about your next project. Tell us about your next book.
So I've had an idea that I hope will become a book that is a historical account of an election fraud scandal that transpired in Terre Haute, Indiana, a little over a century ago. And without getting too deeply in the details of it, it's sort of the there's obviously, it's the most significant election crime dragnet in American history. It comes at a moment where the federal government has recently gotten the authority to be involved in the prosecution of interference in local elections. And in light of the current debate, there was a time when we did have large-scale voter fraud in the United States, and election outcomes almost certainly were affected by it. And often it was the province of like the least powerful people in society trying to police elections to stop powerful people from consolidating their hold on power, not necessarily people who were in power using cries of election fraud to stay in power. And so I'm drawn to it because I think it's a great story, just great characters, and as a true crime yarn. And then I think in this moment, we could stand to have a little more historical context for, given all the before the My Pillow guy, there actually was a sort of noble history of trying to keep our elections clean, that I think can be restored through this story.
Awesome. Well, Sasha, thank you so much. Would you hold up that copy of your book one more time?
Yeah.
Let me switch over where everyone can see it. There we go. So thank you all attendees, and we've got people on Facebook watching as well. Thank you so much for giving up part of your evening to be with us for this discussion. Buy a copy of The Engagement at Midtown Reader. Come by, pick it up. We've got plenty. And again, Sasha Issenberg, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Matt. And thank you, Sally, for having
Thank
me.
you, Sasha. It's great to see you.
Great to
Best
see
of
you.
luck on your book tour.
Thank you very much. Hopefully in person with you guys soon.
Yes,
Yes.
definitely. Thanks a
Thank
bunch.
you. Bye.
Have a good night.
Bye.